everybody, my name is Rachel and welcome to my channel Kalanadi. Today I am reviewing Orbital Cloud by Taiyo Fujii. This is a Japanese science fiction novel that was released from Haikasuru back in March, and it was translated into English by Timothy Silver. I'd call Orbital Cloud a hard science fiction thriller. It was fast-paced, it had tons of interesting technology, it was so interesting and so much fun. It was pretty solid, it had just a few wobbles, maybe in characters and some plot points, but overall it was a really well-told story. It takes place across the world with characters from multiple nations, so a good place to start is by describing the characters. In Japan, we have Kazumi, a web designer who runs the Meteor News website, and Akari, a freelance engineer who works with him. We also have Kurosaki and Sakaguchi, who are officials from JAXA, which is the Japanese space agency. In Iran, we have Jamshed, an astronautical engineer at the Tehran Institute of Technology. In Seattle, in the US, we have Shiraishi, an ex-JAXA official who's gone rogue, and Chance, a North Korean agent and Shiraishi's handler. In an orbital hotel, there is Ronnie Smark, who's kind of a high-powered entrepreneur like Elon Musk, and his daughter Judy, who is a journalist. There are also some other characters like Ozzy, who is a space photographer and investor in the Seychelles, and other characters like 3 NORAD officials and 2 CIA agents. That may seem like a lot of people to keep track of, but it's not an impossible task. Now for the plot. Orbital Cloud is about how people tracking objects in orbit notice that the second stage rocket shell of Safar-3, which is an Iranian satellite I believe, has changed its orbit, which should be impossible. Safar-3 should be slowly descending and eventually burn up in the atmosphere, but instead it's boosted up and behaving strangely. Upon closer inspection, our characters discover that there are clouds of tens of thousands of mysterious objects in orbit. These turn out to be space tethers, possibly launched by North Korea, which may be used to destroy the orbital hotel that the Smarks are in, the International Space Station, and all satellites from all nations in orbit. This would of course have disastrous consequences, including setting space travel back to square one. Thus, a race begins between characters like Kazumi, Akari, and the other Japanese and American agents who are trying to figure out what is in orbit, how the space tethers work, and how to stop them, and on the other side, Chance and Shiraishi, who are trying to stall them long enough for their plan to work. That makes the plot sound pretty simple actually, but really it is more complicated than that. There are many technological problems and characters have to figure out a lot of solutions. There are spies, possible double agents, and a lot of connections to figure out between countries and people. I enjoyed so many things about this book, and one of the #1 things I liked was the setting. This is set in 2020, so it's a relatively modern day setting, and the technology used and mentioned is also modern day rather than being very far future, which is pretty different from a lot of the hard science fiction that I usually read. The IT that characters talk about and use exists today, and if not physically, at least conceptually. So for example, characters use Raspberry Pis all the time. I've never used one myself, but I do know what they are. And along with the setting, I also thought the writing and the translation were great, and the pace of the story was really good. It had a thriller vibe to it, where something exciting is happening in every chapter. If you find solving technical problems to be exciting, I guess. So it wasn't like a hectic pace for me, but it was a real page turner. And also, the characters were good. They weren't perfect, there were some problems, but they were good, and with the exception of some of the American characters, I never confused them. They were all distinct, they had their own personalities rather than being bundles of quirks. Akari was definitely my favorite character by far, and this is not surprising considering she's one of the fewer women in the story, but she's also a brilliant engineer. She's very flexible and fast in her thinking, she adapts quickly, and she demonstrates her abilities so well on the page and to other characters, and is recognized for that, which is great. She's also one of the few characters who has a real inner struggle. Most of these characters are just dealing with the problem of, oh no, things are in orbit, it's gonna all have a disastrous ending. And she has more of an emotional conflict as well, which would be spoilers if I explained that. I could have used more time spent on her emotional conflict. It's not absent, it is mentioned, it is part of the story, but a little bit more reflection on that and having more characters talk about it would have been perfect. I have to say that after finishing this book and reflecting on it a bit more, I am still challenged by some of the questions the story poses. The really big one is it unfair that a handful of countries like the US, Russia, and China dominate space travel? How can developing or smaller countries like Iran and Japan break into astronautics if they're already big players in the field? As a US citizen who's always taken NASA's existence for granted, I had never thought about this before, and it was so interesting to read a story that is by and large motivated by the anger and frustration that this inequality causes. There are brilliant, maybe even genius-level characters in this book, people like Kazumi Akari and Jamshed, who could do amazing things in astronautics, but they lack opportunity, or in Jamshed's case, lack even basic computing power. Jamshed figures out space tethers with the technological equivalent of paper and string cobbled together. And at some point, the wasted talent and potential becomes appalling. Like, our next Einstein could be in Iran, Iraq, or Afghanistan, and we would never know. And finally, some thoughts about this being Japanese. Taiyo Fujii's books are the only Japanese science fiction I have read, so I don't have anything else to compare this to. I did have the benefit of reading this book with Tara, who has lived in Japan and has read a lot of Japanese literature, and she was very helpful in pointing out to me some aspects of the book that were particularly Japanese. In particular, there were some things that I didn't know if they were problems or mistakes or weaknesses, but it turns out that they were just foreign. For example, I noticed some repetition of key facts in the story, which I thought was a sign that it was serialized, because that's something that often happens when a story is cut into chunks and serialized in a magazine. It turns out Orbital Cloud wasn't serialized as far as I know, but that repetition is something that happens in Japanese literature. And of course, it was really interesting to read a book with characters from many nationalities written by someone who is not American. It just flips the perspective on politics and relationships and cultures somewhat. The big one for me that I noticed in this is how different America's attitude towards North Korea is from Japan's attitude towards North Korea. My highest compliment to Orbital Cloud is that it was so much fun to read. I was completely engrossed the entire time. It also reminded me a lot of reading Neal Stephenson, so if you are a fan of Stephenson, maybe give this a try. I would liken it to a cross between Seven Eves and Reamdy, just more compact, more modern day, and with an ending that wraps up more of the loose ends. That is it for my review of Orbital Cloud by Taiyo Fujii. This is absolutely the kind of positive, forward-thinking hard science fiction I can get behind and that I recommend so highly. If you have read this book or maybe something else by Taiyo Fujii, please comment down below and let me know what you thought of it. Thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.